The Dark Scrolls. Under the gentle hush of a fading evening, the air feels thick with the weight of centuries gone by, as if the shadows themselves carry whispers of the past. Tonight we wander through palaces where the scent of candle wax still lingers, down corridors where silk hems once brushed marble floors, and into the guarded chambers where the secrets of princes were woven, not in ink and paper, but in the breathless moments between stolen glances and the rustle of satin sheets. This is not a tale of kingdoms won or lost on the battlefield, but of hearts conquered and discarded, of nights that glowed with firelight and mornings dulled by regret. You may think you know the rulers of Europe by their crowns and coats of arms, but there is another history, soft and scandalous, told only in the hush of midnight. And so, with slow steps, let us open the first door. It begins with Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, a man whose name in courtly records speaks of alliances and expansion, yet whose private life painted a far more vivid, intoxicating picture. His court was not merely a seat of governance, it was a theater of beauty, laughter, and desire. Beneath glittering chandeliers, women of every station drifted through the rooms like petals on a perfumed breeze, each drawn to him by that curious mix of authority and warmth. Philip collected lovers as a jeweler might collect rare gems, each precious in her own way. Chroniclers spoke almost with awe of the 24 mistresses who held his attention at different times, and of the 18 children born beyond the boundaries of marriage. To the church it was sin, to the nobility it was gossip, but to Philip it was life, as natural as breathing. One can almost hear the muted strains of music in his great hall, the glint of gold-threaded tapestries behind him, as he smiled at a new face across the crowd, knowing, perhaps, that her name would soon be part of his ever-growing private history. From Burgundy we drift west, where the warm light of the French sun falls on the reign of Henry IV. Known to his people as a king of charm and vitality, Henry's reputation in matters of the heart outshone even his political triumphs. He was no brooding monarch hidden behind stone walls. He walked among his subjects, laughed with them, and loved them, or at least the women among them. His mistresses were not confined to the nobility. Beauty and spirit alone could open the door to his favor. It is said that when he entered a room, conversation paused, not for fear, but for the awareness that his eyes might rest upon you, and in that moment your life could change. His love affairs were woven into the fabric of his reign, producing children who bore his blood but not his name. Yet, even as politics demanded his attention, he always found time for the softer intrigues that warmed his nights. To Henry, affection was as much a tool of diplomacy as treaties and armies, and in his wake he left not just laws and decrees, but whispered stories that would survive centuries. Far to the northeast, another figure emerges from the mists of history, Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor. His world was one of contradictions, opulent yet shadowed, brilliant yet touched with an eccentricity that unsettled even his closest advisors. His court in Prague was a sanctuary for artists, scientists, and philosophers, but behind its tall windows and velvet drapes, Rudolph pursued passions that defied convention. His liaisons spanned class and expectation, crossing into realms that courtiers dared not name aloud. He fathered illegitimate children with women of the court, yet rumors hinted at bonds formed with the young men who served him, a scandal that in those times carried dangerous implications. In his presence there was an air of unpredictability, as though love for him was not bound by rules but by the shape of desire itself. One might picture him leaning over an astronomer's chart by day, then slipping into shadowed corridors at night, following not the stars but the pull of human connection. And then the tale takes us to the glittering salons of Vienna, where Nicholas II, Prince Esterhazy, moved through his world like a comet trailing heat and destruction. His reputation was not simply for wealth and position, but for an appetite that knew no boundaries. 200 mistresses, it was said, so many that even those who tried to catalogue his affairs gave up in exhaustion. Over 100 children were rumored to have sprung from these encounters, scattered like wildflowers across the estates and villages of his domain. In the grand ballrooms where crystal chandeliers scattered light across his guests, Nikolaus was never far from a woman's side, his voice low, his hand resting lightly against the back of a gown, his gaze promising more than polite conversation. To those who envied him, his life was a dangerous luxury. To those who loved him, it was a fleeting blaze, beautiful while it lasted but gone too soon. These men, different in their lands and crowns, were bound by a hunger that history often prefers to gloss over. Yet in these quiet hours, we can let the facade of royal dignity fall away and watch them not as rulers, but as men, each driven by an unspoken yearning. The sound of laughter in a darkened hallway, the faint perfume left on a sleeve, the warmth of a stolen embrace. These are the threads that wove their secret legacies. As the candles burn low, we have only begun to open their stories. Ahead lies England, where two kings, separated by time but united in indulgence, await their turn to step from the shadows into the soft glow of memory. The story of Philip the Good unfolds like a tapestry woven from threads of gold and shadow, where every stitch holds the memory of a moment shared in quiet intimacy or reckless abandon. Born into power, he was raised among the trappings of privilege. Tall windows spilling light across polished floors, the steady rustle of servants moving like ghosts through the halls, the scent of beeswax and parchment lingering in the air. But beneath the disciplined lessons in statecraft, beneath the carefully measured words of tutors and advisers, there pulsed an insatiable curiosity for beauty in all its forms. His court at Dijon became a living gallery, not just of art and riches, but of human charm. Women came to him as if drawn by gravity, and he, in turn, collected their company with a careful, almost artistic precision. To the outside world, his relationships might seem fleeting, but to Philip, each was a chapter in an ongoing private epic. One could imagine a winter evening, the wind battering against the shutters, as he sat by the hearth with a favored mistress, her laughter soft and warm against the backdrop of the storm. In such moments, the Duke was not ruler of Burgundy, not the architect of alliances, but a man who savored the fleeting sweetness of companionship. Yet these moments were numerous, and with each passing year the list of lovers grew longer. His 24 mistresses were not simply names in a ledger, they were living echoes in the vast chambers of his memory, and through them 18 children carried his legacy beyond the confines of the royal marriage bed. The church scolded, the nobility whispered, but the Duke remained unrepentant. Love, to him, was as much a part of his reign as law and war, and in the quiet of night he must have known that this too would outlast him in the telling. From Burgundy's candle-lit halls, the scene shifts to the rich gardens and bustling avenues of late 16th century France, where Henry IV walked with the ease of a man who knew he was beloved. His reign was marked by the scent of blooming lavender, the hum of marketplaces, the chatter of courtiers who never tired of speculating about his latest conquest. Henry's smile was a weapon, warm, confident, disarming, and his eyes could pierce through the most carefully constructed defenses. His lovers came from every walk of life, from ladies of high birth to women whose beauty shone brighter than their titles. To Henry, desire was not bound by class. It was an instinct, a spark that could catch in the most unexpected of places. Imagine him in a grand reception room, his presence commanding yet approachable, the music of a string ensemble spilling through the air. Across the room, a woman meets his gaze. In that instant, the world narrows to the space between them. Perhaps a hand brushed hers later, perhaps a note was exchanged, folded small and slipped into the palm during a formal bow. Each affair was a delicate dance of secrecy and display, for while the king's appetite was no secret, the intimacy of each connection was fiercely guarded. His illegitimate children grew up in the shadow of his reign, some acknowledged, some left to live lives apart from the crown, yet all bound to him by blood. Henry's political genius was mirrored in his romantic cunning. A mistress could be more than a companion. She could be an ambassador, a link to an influential family, a silent ally in courtly intrigue. In this way, his passions were woven directly into the fabric of his governance. It was said that he ruled France with one hand on the throne and the other entwined with a lover's fingers. And perhaps that was true. His reign left France stronger, but his personal life left the tapestry of European gossip far richer than any treaty could. In Prague, under skies heavy with snow in winter and blooming with lilacs in spring, Rudolph II presided over a court that was as much a sanctuary for the mind as it was a playground for the heart. Here, alchemists toiled over strange metals, painters splashed color onto vast canvases, and philosophers argued under candlelight that burned well past midnight. Yet, amid the intellectual ferment, the emperor's own desires were as restless as the city's shifting seasons. His liaisons moved in whispers through the palace corridors, servants slipping through side doors, a favored courtesan arriving under the cover of dusk, the brief glint of a jeweled hairpin disappearing into his private chambers. Rudolph was drawn to those who stirred his mind as well as his body. He sought not only beauty but intrigue, often choosing companions whose very presence challenged convention. The women of his court brought him pleasure, but rumors curled like smoke around his name, hinting at a fascination with certain young men in his service. In an age where such affections could invite scandal or ruin, Rudolph walked a dangerous line, yet he seemed indifferent to the risk. He was a man ruled not by the laws of the empire he governed, but by the tides of his own longing. His illegitimate children, scattered across the empire, bore silent testimony to his private life, though none could claim a public place at his side. To those who knew him best, Rudolph was a study in contrasts, stern and distant at the throne, yet vulnerable and fevered in the darkened hours of the night. From Prague's misted spires, we are carried to the grandeur of the Esterhazy estates, where Nicholas II lived like a prince in a dream, one from which he had no wish to awaken. The ballrooms of his palaces glowed with golden light, the air filled with the strains of orchestras and the scent of hothouse flowers. He moved through these gatherings with the assurance of a man accustomed to admiration, his voice smooth, his touch lingering just long enough to spark speculation. 200 mistresses. It seems almost a fable, a number so vast that it blurs into legend. Yet those who chronicled his life insisted it was no exaggeration. The children who sprang from these countless affairs were said to number over 100, their faces scattered across the map of his realm. Some lived in quiet villages, unaware of their connection to the prince. Others grew up within sight of his estates, shadows in his gilded life. To Nicholas, these encounters were as natural as the changing of the seasons. The thrill of the chase, the sweetness of conquest, the inevitable fade into memory, each was part of the cycle he seemed destined to repeat. When he danced, it was as if the music itself bent to his will. When he whispered, it was with the promise of an experience that would burn brightly, if briefly. And though his romances ended as quickly as they began, the allure of his presence lingered, leaving behind a wake of longing that might last a lifetime. By the time the candles gutter low in these first chambers of our journey, the shapes of these men are clearer. They were rulers, yes, but also dreamers, seducers, and wanderers of the heart. Each left behind a legacy not only of laws and battles, but of moments, shared glances, whispered confessions, and the quiet weight of promises made and broken. Ahead, across the channel, the English kings await, their own tales no less rich in intrigue and indulgence, their lives a reminder that the heart of royalty is as prone to folly as that of any common soul. And so, as the night deepens, we prepare to open the next door. Across the restless waters of the English Channel, the glow of candlelight falls upon a land whose kings are remembered as much for their pleasures as for their policies. The story moves now into the drawing rooms and smoking lounges of England, where the air is thick with the scent of cigars, polished wood, and ambition. Here, in the fading decades of the 19th century, Edward VII waits in the wings of history, not yet crowned, but already a monarch in all but name when it came to indulgence. The son of Queen Victoria, Edward was born into the heavy shadow of a mother who prized moral restraint and public virtue. Yet he carried in him a restlessness that could not be contained within those rigid walls. As a young prince, Edward found the life laid before him, ceremonies, lessons, endless protocol, stifling. His escape was found in salons where laughter spilled into the early hours, in dining rooms heavy with the aroma of rich food and wine, in the warmth of a whispered conversation shared behind a closed door. He became known as Bertie to his friends and lovers, a name far less formal than the one inscribed in state documents. To the public, he embodied the glamour of a world just beginning to step into the modern age. To the women who knew him, he was more than a royal title. He was a man who listened, who laughed, and who made them feel, for a night or a season, that they were the only star in his orbit. His affairs, numerous and sometimes brazen, threaded through the fabric of high society. Actresses, aristocrats, and courtesans alike found themselves at his side. The scandal sheets thrived on rumors of his attachments, and yet his popularity never seemed to waver. Perhaps it was because Edward understood the performance of charm, how to be both attentive and elusive, how to give enough of himself to captivate, but never so much that the spell would break. As he moved through gilded ballrooms and private clubs, one could almost hear the murmur of admiration that followed him like an echo, the soft rustle of silk dresses brushing past, as eyes lingered just a moment too long. But Edward's England was not the first to know such rulers. Years earlier, another king had walked the same marble halls with an equally insatiable appetite, George IV. His reign began in the age of the Regency, when his father's illness placed the crown's duties in his hands, long before they rested upon his head. George's world was one of lavish spending, architectural grandeur, and an almost theatrical pursuit of beauty. His palaces were showcases not only of art and design, but of the women who moved through them, each a fleeting muse in his restless gallery. George's tastes were extravagant in every sense. He dressed with the meticulous care of a man who understood the power of appearance, coats cut to flatter, jewels that caught the light, and scents imported from far-off lands. In love, as in fashion, he sought novelty and intensity. His relationships, though numerous, were rarely quiet affairs. They unfolded under the scrutiny of courtiers and the whispered judgments of the public. Yet George seemed almost to thrive on the attention. To him, romance was another form of spectacle, each affair a stage upon which he could play the role of the ardent suitor, the wounded lover, or the magnanimous benefactor. Behind closed doors, however, there was a different George, less concerned with the approval of the crowd, more absorbed in the pleasures of intimacy. He could be tender, even vulnerable, with those he trusted. There were nights when the grandeur of his surroundings faded into the background, when the only thing that mattered was the curve of a smile across the table, the weight of a hand in his own. And yet, inevitably, the curtain would fall, and the affair would become another story in the vast collection that defined his private life. From England's rain-washed streets, the narrative turns south, to Bavaria, where Ludwig I ruled with a heart as steeped in passion as in art. Ludwig was not merely a patron of beauty, he was consumed by it. His reign was marked by the construction of grand buildings and the commissioning of paintings and sculptures that celebrated the human form. But it was in his personal life that his devotion to beauty reached its most intimate expression. Ludwig's eyes were ever drawn to the women who crossed his path, whether they were court ladies, artists, or women of more humble origins. One such muse, the dancer Lola Montez, became a figure of both inspiration and scandal. With her dark hair and fierce spirit, she captured Ludwig's attention in a way few others could. Their relationship was tempestuous, a collision of two strong wills bound together by desire and defiance of convention. Lola moved through the Bavarian court like a flame, igniting gossip and resentment in equal measure. Yet Ludwig was unmoved by the disapproval of his ministers and subjects. In her presence he seemed to forget the weight of his crown. His other affairs, too, reflected this hunger for the extraordinary, for women whose beauty was matched by their ability to stir his imagination. Even as his reign faced political challenges, Ludwig's romantic entanglements remained a constant. They were as much a part of his identity as his cultural projects, each love affair another brushstroke in the portrait of a king who sought to live surrounded by the things that stirred his soul. To walk through the galleries he commissioned is to sense, even now, the gaze of a man who found divinity in human beauty, who believed that to love was as vital as to rule. From Bavaria, the story drifts to Spain in the early 20th century, where Alfonso XIII inherited a kingdom teetering between tradition and the winds of change. Tall, handsome, and possessed of a certain restless energy, Alfonso was every inch the modern monarch in public, yet in private, his pursuits followed a path well trodden by his royal predecessors. His charm was undeniable, his smile quick to appear, his conversation animated. Women, both of the court and beyond, found themselves drawn to him, and Alfonso, for his part, rarely resisted such attentions. But his legacy of romance was shadowed by a darker intrigue. Whispers spread through Madrid of the king's fascination with the illicit world of erotic cinema, a fascination that, according to rumor, extended beyond mere viewing. It was said that he financed the production of such films, a revelation that would have scandalized the nation had it been proven in his time. These rumors, true or not, clung to his reputation, entwining his name with a world far removed from the duties of a sovereign. In this, Alfonso's private life reflected the shifting morals of an age where old certainties were beginning to crumble, and where even kings could not shield their desires from the gaze of the public. Through these stories a thread emerges, binding Edward, George, Ludwig, and Alfonso to the princes of the first part of our journey. Though separated by centuries and borders, each was driven by a yearning that defied the constraints of their station. Their crowns did not protect them from longing, nor did their wealth free them from the vulnerabilities of the heart. Instead, these things magnified their desires, placing them under a lens that preserved their passions for history to remember. And so the night deepens. The tales of these men, rich with indulgence and shadowed by scandal, settle around us like the heavy drapes of a royal chamber. They remind us that behind the gilded facades and the weight of state, there beats the same restless pulse that moves in all of us, the need to be seen, to be touched, to be remembered. Ahead lies the quiet reflection of their legacies and the lingering question of whether it was love they sought or merely the echo of it in the warmth of another's arms. Edward VII's world was one of contrasts, a prince who carried the weight of expectation by day and shed it like a heavy cloak when the lamps were dimmed. His mother's court was suffocating with propriety. Every gesture, every glance was weighed against the rigid moral compass of Victorian England. Yet Bertie, as his intimates called him, was made of a different metal. He found joy not in the polished stiffness of court protocol, but in the warmth of voices raised in song after midnight, in the shimmer of champagne poured into cut crystal, in the press of a hand beneath the table when no one was watching. It was not that Edward lacked the sense of duty expected of a future king. In public, he could be the model of decorum, delivering speeches with practiced ease, greeting dignitaries with just the right measure of warmth. But there was a part of him that seemed forever to seek life outside the gilded cage, something spontaneous, untamed. That search led him into the arms of actresses whose laughter filled smoky backstage dressing rooms, into the salons of Paris where conversation was spiced with wit and suggestion, into the quiet retreats of country houses where the air was thick with the scent of roses and secrecy. One mistress, Lily Langtry, became almost a public extension of his private self. The Jersey Lily, as society called her, was more than a beauty. She was clever, poised, and unafraid to meet Edward's charm with her own sharp intelligence. Their connection endured even as other lovers came and went, a reminder that some bonds, however unorthodox, could withstand the passing of years. And there were others, dozens more, whose names flickered briefly in the pages of society columns before vanishing into the footnotes of history. To Edward, each was a chapter, a moment in which he could step away from the relentless march toward kingship and simply be a man in pursuit of pleasure. George IV, by contrast, seemed almost born for spectacle. His tastes were opulent to the point of excess. Even his critics admitted he had an unerring eye for beauty, whether in architecture, dress, or companionship. As the Prince Regent, he turned Carlton House into a palace of delights, its walls hung with masterpieces, its rooms echoing with the strains of orchestras brought in to entertain until dawn. In such surroundings, romance was inevitable, and George pursued it with the same lavish energy he applied to everything else. His early love affair with Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic widow, was both passionate and politically perilous. Their union, carried out in secret, was never recognized under English law, yet George remained devoted to her for much of his life, even as he entertained a succession of other lovers. There was a theatricality to his romances, a sense that each was a performance meant to dazzle the audience as much as to satisfy his own heart. He gave extravagant gifts, diamonds, estates, gowns of the finest silk, and in return basked in the admiration they brought him. But for all his outward confidence, George was not immune to the quieter needs of affection. In moments away from the glittering ballrooms, he could be reflective, even melancholy, as though aware that the applause would eventually fade. The Bavarian court of Ludwig I offers a different palette entirely, less rigid than England, more willing to indulge the artistic temperament of its ruler. Ludwig's Munich was a city of galleries, theaters, and opera houses, each a testament to his belief that beauty was the highest calling of a king. Yet his patronage of the arts was matched, if not outstripped, by his patronage of beauty in flesh and blood. The women who entered his life became subjects of paintings, recipients of titles, inspirations for poetry. Lola Montez was the most famous of them all, a woman whose allure was matched only by her defiance of social convention. Their relationship was a tempest, passionate declarations followed by furious quarrels, reconciliations sealed in the privacy of Ludwig's chambers. Lola's influence over the king was such that she was granted titles and privileges, provoking outrage among the conservative factions of the court. Still, Ludwig held his ground, unwilling to relinquish the woman who had so thoroughly captured his imagination. His devotion to Lola was mirrored, in smaller ways, in his attentions to countless others. To Ludwig, love and art were inseparable. Each affair was a living masterpiece, vivid and transient. Alfonso XIII of Spain inherited a throne in an age of uncertainty, where old empires trembled and the modern world pressed in with new demands. Yet, even amid political unrest and the threat of war, Alfonso found time for pursuits of the heart. His charm was immediate, an easy smile, a quick wit, the ability to make a woman feel as though she alone occupied his thoughts. In the salons of Madrid, in the shaded gardens of royal estates, his presence was magnetic. But Alfonso's name became entangled in whispers that hinted at a more scandalous passion, the financing of risque films. Whether the stories were true or the invention of political enemies, they clung to him, coloring the perception of his private life. The thought of a king indulging in such pursuits was, to many, both shocking and oddly humanizing. In these rumors, Alfonso was not a distant ruler, but a man of flesh and blood, vulnerable to the same curiosities and desires that drew others into shadowed theaters and locked rooms. When placed alongside Edward's easy charm, George's theatrical extravagance, Ludwig's artistic devotion, and Alfonso's rumored indulgences, a pattern emerges. These men, for all their crowns and titles, shared a refusal to be bound entirely by the expectations of their positions. Their courts were not merely centers of governance, but stages for 1,000 private dramas, some whispered about in corridors, others splashed across the gossip sheets of their day. One can imagine a gathering in some impossible, timeless hall where these princes meet. Edward leaning back with a knowing smile, George recounting a grand romantic gesture, Ludwig describing a painting of his latest muse, Alfonso laughing softly at a half-remembered scandal. The air would be thick with the scent of cigars and perfume, the flicker of candlelight catching on jeweled cuffs and glinting eyes. They would understand one another without the need for explanation, bound by a shared knowledge that power may command obedience, but it is desire that commands the heart. And yet, for all the indulgence and excess, there lingers a question that threads through their stories. Did these men truly seek love, or only the momentary intoxication of its pursuit? In the quiet after the music faded, when the last guest had gone and the fire burned low, perhaps they felt it, the stillness, the emptiness that no banquet or beauty could quite fill. It is in that silence that the true measure of their hearts might be found. In the quiet corridors of history, the echoes of these men's footsteps have not faded. The palaces they once inhabited still stand, their walls absorbing the murmur of conversations long past, their marble floors polished smooth by centuries of movement. Yet, it is not the official records that keep their memory alive. It is the tapestry of whispered tales, the stories traded by courtiers, the hints buried in letters never meant for public eyes. Power and pleasure are old companions, and in the lives of Philip, Henry, Rudolph, Nicholas, Edward, George, Ludwig, and Alfonso, the two were intertwined in ways both intoxicating and dangerous. The allure they held in life did not simply vanish with their passing. In Burgundy, Philip the Good's patronage of the arts and diplomacy remains part of the nation's cultural fabric. Yet in the minds of many, his image is forever softened by the thought of those private evenings spent with his chosen companions. The portraits that survive show a man composed, regal, and unyielding. But somewhere in the archives, in the letters exchanged with his mistresses, there is a different Philip, one who laughed, who made promises in the dark, who traced the curve of a lover's face as though committing it to memory. These fragments reveal that even the most formidable rulers could be undone by something as simple as affection. Henry IV's France, for all its political complexities, remembers him as much for his charm as for his leadership. The Vert Galant, they called him, the Green Gallant, an affectionate nickname for a king whose energy in matters of love seemed as inexhaustible as his political will. Statues in Paris commemorate his reign, but the legacy that lingers most vividly is less tangible. It is the romanticized vision of a monarch who could disarm his enemies with a smile and captivate his subjects with the warmth of his presence. Yet beneath this golden memory lies the reality that such openness came at a cost. His affairs sometimes complicated alliances. His devotion to certain women stirred jealousy and tension in the court. Still, his reign suggests that perhaps love, genuine or fleeting, can be a kind of governance in itself, binding people to a ruler not by law, but by sentiment. Rudolph II's Prague remains a city of mystery, steeped in the alchemy and art he so passionately encouraged. Tourists walk the same cobblestone streets he once traversed, admiring the towers and bridges he knew well. Yet, for those who look deeper, there is the shadow of his private life, hinted at in the careful omissions of official records. He is remembered as an eccentric, a dreamer emperor whose interests defied the rigid structures of his office. And while historians debate the truth of certain rumors, lovers of both genders, the quiet proliferation of illegitimate heirs, the effect is the same. Rudolph emerges as a man who lived according to his own desires, even when they defied the conventions of his age. It is this defiance, perhaps more than any imperial decree, that cements his place in the realm of fascination. Nikolaus II, Prince Esterhazy, left behind a lineage tangled in rumor and reality. The vast number of his supposed descendants makes tracing his bloodline a feat worthy of its own legend. In the grand halls of Esterhazy Palace, where gilded mirrors still reflect the light of chandeliers, one might almost hear the laughter of his endless soirees, the clink of glasses raised in yet another toast to beauty and excess. But there is another side to his memory, stories of women left behind, of children growing up in the shadow of a father they knew only by name or by whispered admission. For all the warmth and charm he could display in the moment, the wake of his passions was littered with lives that were forever altered, for better or worse, by his attention. In England, Edward VII's reign is remembered for its elegance, for ushering in the Edwardian era with its blend of modernity and refinement. His love of fine clothes, racing, and the company of captivating women became part of the very identity of the period. The Marlborough House set, as his close circle of friends was called, was as much a social phenomenon as a political one, an elite group that blurred the lines between governance and pleasure. For Edward, the charm that won hearts in private often translated into diplomacy in public. Many a political relationship was softened, if not secured, over shared indulgence. Yet the same habits that made him beloved also fed the image of a king more devoted to leisure than to labor, a perception that still shadows his otherwise accomplished reign. George IV's memory is etched in the architecture he commissioned, in the Brighton Pavilion's exotic domes, and the refinement of Windsor Castle. His tastes reshaped parts of England, leaving behind structures that still inspire awe. Yet even these achievements are often recounted alongside the tales of his excess, his debts, his lovers, the elaborate entertainments that seemed to consume him. In him, the duality of king and man is perhaps most stark, a ruler capable of vision, yet also a prisoner of his appetites. His love affairs were not mere footnotes. They influenced the court's dynamics, shifted alliances, and in some cases altered the course of his personal and political relationships. Ludwig I of Bavaria remains in the popular imagination the king who gave his people art and beauty, and who allowed his own passions to become public scandal. The Lola Montez affair is retold with the cadence of a fable, the king who defied convention for love, and the woman who both inspired and endangered his throne. Even now in Munich, her name is spoken with a mix of admiration and censure. Ludwig's galleries and monuments endure as proof of his cultural devotion, but his reputation as a lover is inseparable from his identity. To some, this duality tarnishes his reign. To others, it humanizes him, making him more than a distant figure in a portrait. Alfonso XIII's Spain still carries the imprint of his turbulent era. political instability, social change, the looming shadow of the modern age. His rumored involvement in the world of erotic cinema remains one of the most sensational aspects of his biography, lending him an air of mystery that continues to attract curiosity. For some, it is an unforgivable blemish on his name. For others, it is merely evidence that kings, too, are men, drawn to the forbidden and the alluring. In a way, these whispers have ensured that Alfonso's name has not faded into the anonymity that often claims monarchs of shifting eras. Taken together, the legacies of these 8 men form a mosaic of desire, ambition, and consequence. Their romantic pursuits were not isolated indulgences. They were part of the machinery of their reigns, influencing alliances, public perception, and the private lives of countless individuals. They remind us that history is not a dry record of battles and treaties. It is also the sum of human passions, the stories that unfold behind closed doors but ripple outward in ways that shape nations. And yet, for all the opulence and scandal, there is a thread of loneliness woven through their tales. Perhaps it comes from the knowledge that in the end, each moment of intimacy was fleeting, each connection vulnerable to the pressures of their station. Lovers came and went, their names fading into the folds of time, while the princes remained, unchanged in title, but altered in ways only they could feel. In the quiet moments when the applause had faded and the banquet hall was empty, they must have felt it, that longing for something enduring, something beyond the reach of beauty and desire alone. As night deepens around us, we begin to see these princes not as symbols, but as men. Men who loved, who erred, who sought solace in the arms of others. Their crowns did not shield them from the hunger for connection. If anything, the isolation of power made that hunger all the more acute. And perhaps it is this shared humanity, more than any decree or conquest, that ensures they remain in our stories. The night still has one final chapter for them, where memory and myth intertwine, and where we may glimpse, just for a moment, the truth behind the legends. In the final years of their lives, the glitter began to fade from the edges of these men's stories. For Philip the Good, the great duke who had once moved between lovers as easily as one might stroll through a garden, age came quietly but unrelentingly. His hair, once dark, silvered beneath the weight of years, and his eyes, though still sharp, held a depth of reflection absent in his youth. In the evenings he would retreat to smaller, warmer rooms of his estates, rooms where the echo of laughter from old banquets no longer reached him. There, surrounded by a few trusted attendants, he would linger over letters from the past, their parchment worn, the ink faded but still legible. Some were love notes, others diplomatic in tone but colored with the private warmth he could never entirely keep from his words. He never said aloud which memories he cherished most, but sometimes as a fire crackled and shadows danced on the walls, a faint smile would curve his lips, a smile only those who had once been truly in love could understand. Henry IV's final days were less tranquil. The Vert Galant had lived as if the world's beauty were inexhaustible, yet his reign had been shadowed by assassination attempts and political unrest. In those moments when danger brushed too close, he found himself thinking of the women who had brought him comfort, the ones whose presence had reminded him why life was worth defending. When death finally came for him in the form of an assassin's blade on a crowded Paris street, the city mourned not just the king, but the man who had walked among them without armor between his heart and theirs. His mistresses, some still young, others long past the age of beauty in the eyes of the court, grieved in silence, each carrying a piece of a man whose love had been vast, if fleeting. Rudolph II's passing in Prague was a quieter affair. The city had grown accustomed to his eccentric ways, to the strange collection of treasures in his private chambers, globes, rare stones, paintings, curious mechanisms of brass and glass. In those rooms where light filtered softly through tall windows, the emperor spent his later years increasingly withdrawn, surrounded by the relics of both his political ambitions and his personal desires. His illegitimate children were never gathered together. Some might never have known of each other's existence. Yet they carried in their veins the quiet legacy of a man who had defied the rigid codes of his time and whose private life had been as complex as the empire he ruled. Nikolaos II, the great Prince Esterhazy, aged with a mixture of grace and stubborn pride. Even as the vigor of youth left him, he clung to the rituals of charm, receiving guests in finely tailored coats, keeping his conversation lively, his smile ready. But the endless procession of lovers slowed, and the great count of his children, whispered in salons and back rooms, became less a scandal than a kind of legend. He would sit in his gardens, watching the sunlight sift through the leaves, and one could almost imagine him counting not the years left to him, but the memories, faces he could still recall, voices that had once called his name in the hush before dawn. For Edward VII, the transition to kingship brought with it the knowledge that every moment of his life was now under an even harsher light. Yet his charm did not diminish. Instead, it took on a gentler form. The reckless pursuits of his youth were replaced by more deliberate acts of kindness, though the appetite for companionship never fully left him. In his final years, he surrounded himself with familiar faces, friends, loyal attendants, and the women whose presence had weathered the seasons. When he died, the mourning was sincere and widespread. The public remembered not just a king, but a man whose warmth had bridged the often cold divide between ruler and ruled. George IV's later life was marked by failing health and a body worn down by years of indulgence. The elegance and showmanship of his earlier days gave way to a slower, more reclusive existence. Yet he never fully abandoned the trappings of beauty. He still demanded fine clothing, still arranged his rooms with care, still kept portraits of women who had once shared his life. Some nights he would have the musicians play soft airs from decades past, and though his guests saw only a tired king at rest, perhaps in his mind he was back in the grand ballrooms, watching the swirl of gowns and feeling once again the thrill of being the center of every gaze. Ludwig I, in his twilight years, found solace in the art he had gathered, in the galleries that would outlast him. The Lola Montez affair had left scars, political and personal, but it had also solidified his belief that love, in whatever form it takes, is worth the risk. He would walk the halls of his collections slowly, pausing before portraits of women whose beauty had once caught his eye, their faces immortalized in oil and canvas. The whispers of scandal had quieted, replaced by a kind of indulgent respect for a king who had lived unapologetically by his passions. Alfonso XIII, after losing his throne, carried with him the dual identity of exile and former monarch. In the quiet of foreign rooms, far from Madrid's familiar streets, he would sometimes entertain visitors with stories, some of politics, others of a more personal nature, the kind that drew a sly smile from his lips. The rumors that had once swirled around him seemed almost quaint in exile, yet they clung to him, as much a part of his legend as his royal lineage. In those later years he appeared less concerned with the judgment of history, and more inclined to savor the fleeting pleasures still within his reach. Across these lives the common thread was not merely their pursuit of pleasure, but their insistence on living fully in the moments they could claim as their own. Their reigns were shaped as much by their private choices as by public duty, and their legacies, though softened or sharpened by time, still carry the imprint of human desire. The banquet halls are empty now, the music long faded, but the memory of those nights, those glances, those whispered promises, still lingers like the scent of perfume in an abandoned room. In seeing them this way, not just as princes and kings, but as men, We are reminded that history's grandest figures are rarely made of marble alone. They are flesh and spirit, flawed and yearning, their lives a weave of triumphs and follies. And perhaps that is why, centuries later, we still lean in to hear their stories. The night in our tale has deepened, and the flicker of the last candles casts long, swaying shadows against the ancient stone. The voices of these princes, which have accompanied us through centuries, now begin to soften, as if time itself is calling them away. Yet before they fade entirely into the dark, we stand for a moment at the threshold of their legacies, looking back over the opulence and the ruin, the joy and the sorrow that defined them. In the salons of Europe, long after their passing, their names were spoken not with the solemnity reserved for monarchs, but with the half-smile and raised brow that accompanies stories both scandalous and beloved. A courtesan in Paris might recall the tenderness of Henry IV's words, passed down from a grandmother who once served at court. An aging valet in London might recount the effortless grace with which Edward VII could charm a room into silence. In Munich, a gallery attendant could tell you which of Ludwig's portraits were said to be painted not just for art, but for love. History is often a cold thing. Dates, treaties, the sweep of armies across maps. But the stories of these men live not in the halls of politics, but in the human heart. Their conquests were not only of territories, but of moments, the soft clasp of a hand in a shadowed garden, the glint of candlelight reflected in a lover's eyes, the dangerous thrill of a kiss stolen when the world was watching. These moments, small yet infinite, carried a power that no crown could command. For Philip the Good, his enduring image in Burgundy's collective memory is not the cold statesman of portraits, but the man who could bring warmth into a room simply by entering it, the man whose quiet laugh could melt the most carefully guarded reserve. The alliances he forged in the name of politics were mirrored by the connections he wove in private, some brief, others enduring for years. Henry IV's France remembers a king who blurred the lines between ruler and friend. His reign brought peace to a country long fractured by war, but his personal life reminded his subjects that even kings could be touched by the universal hunger for affection. There was in him a generosity of spirit that made his many affairs less about conquest and more about connection. He did not so much take love as invite it, and it is this that softens his legacy in the minds of those who tell his story. Rudolph II remains a puzzle. The scholars speak of him as a patron of the arts, a collector of wonders, a man whose curiosity spanned from the heavens to the smallest mechanical marvel. But the private Rudolph, the one who moved quietly through his palace at night, seeking company that soothed rather than challenged, belongs to another history entirely, a history built on murmurs and speculation. He is the ghost at the window, watching a city that never fully understood him. Nicholas II's legend has been shaped as much by exaggeration as by truth, but that is the nature of such lives. 200 mistresses, 100 children, numbers become symbols, less a ledger than an embodiment of appetite. Whether the exact count was true matters less than the image it paints. A prince whose life was a constant feast, and who, in the end, was remembered as a man who never learned the meaning of restraint. The English kings, Edward and George, remain intertwined in the public mind, their reigns separated by time but joined by the shared thread of indulgence. Edward's charm was the soft glow of a late afternoon sun, warm and inviting. George's was the glitter of a chandelier, dazzling and impossible to ignore. Both left behind more than political reforms. They left an atmosphere, a sense of court life that was equal parts theater and intimacy. Ludwig I's Bavaria still holds the echo of his passions in its art and architecture. Walk through Munich and you can still feel the pulse of his devotion, not just to beauty in stone and paint, but to beauty that breathes, that walks, that defies the stillness of portraits. Lola Montez's shadow still falls across his story, her name inseparable from his, in the way only true obsessions can bind two people. Alfonso XIII's Spain is gone, but the man remains in the collective memory, part monarch, part exile, part myth. The rumors of his private pursuits have become almost folkloric, softened by time into something between amusement and fascination. In him we see the final echo of a certain kind of European royalty, one where desire was as much a part of the crown as duty. And so we reach the place where all such stories lead, not the throne room, but the quiet after the feast, when the music has ended and only the scent of extinguished candles lingers in the air. The men who filled these rooms are gone, but the air is still heavy with what they left behind. We will step into that silence now, for the final part of their tale lies not in what they did, but in what their stories have become. The silence after the feast is always the most revealing. Without the music, without the applause, without the rustle of silks and the clink of crystal, what remains is the weight of memory. It settles gently, like dust motes in the low light, carrying with it the faces, the voices, the unspoken promises of years gone by. For those who served these princes, their memories were as personal as they were political. A chamberlain might recall the hurried knock at a private door, the urgent whispers that spoke of a lover arriving in secret. A maid might remember smoothing the creases from a gown discarded hastily upon a chair. An equerry could still picture the king riding out at dawn, not for a hunt or a council, but to meet someone waiting beyond the city walls. These recollections, small and intimate, were never recorded in chronicles, yet they formed the heartbeat of each reign. And so, as the years turned into decades and decades into centuries, the princes themselves slipped from flesh into story. Their names became shorthand for charm, for extravagance, for the dangerous seduction of power when joined with beauty. Historians debated their policies, poets borrowed their likenesses, novelists wove them into romances both grand and tragic. But the truest version of their lives remained in the margins, in the scented paper of a letter kept hidden in a drawer, in the locket containing a miniature portrait, in the pressed flower between the pages of a diary. Philip the Good's Burgundy still breathes in the quiet courtyards of Dijon. Somewhere, in an attic that smells of cedar, there may still be a scrap of ribbon tied long ago by a woman who once walked with him in a winter garden. Henry IV's Paris still has balconies that catch the same late afternoon light that once warmed his shoulders as he bent to kiss a waiting hand. Rudolph II's Prague still glimmers under moonlight, the same moon he might have stared at through a frost-fogged window, wondering if the one he desired was thinking of him. Nicolaus II's legend still lives in the laughter of Vienna's cafes, where storytellers gesture grandly as they recount the endless list of his loves, each one more improbable than the last. Edward VII's London still holds the hum of conversation in private clubs, where older men recall the way he could disarm a rival with a joke. George IV's Brighton pavilion still smells faintly of the spices he adored, its rooms as flamboyant as the life he lived. Munich's galleries still hold Ludwig I's chosen muses in oil and canvas, their painted eyes meeting yours as though they know his gaze lingers still. In Madrid, the sun still falls across old cinema facades, and if you listen closely, you might hear someone whisper Alfonso XIII's name with a sly smile. Time, of course, takes what it will. The scandals that once shocked Europe now feel almost tender in their audacity. The loves that were once dangerous secrets are now told like bedtime stories for those who adore the romance of history. What was once forbidden has, in many cases, become simply human. The princes are no longer judged by the standards of their own day, but by ours, and in that shift they seem less like rulers and more like companions in the long, flawed, beautiful history of love. The last candle is almost gone now, its wax pooling in the curve of its holder. The air is warm, heavy with the sense of something ending. If you close your eyes, you might still hear them. The low chuckle of Philip the Good, the smooth compliment of Henry IV, the quiet musing of Rudolph II, the extravagant laughter of Nicholas II, the confident drawl of Edward VII, the dramatic sigh of George IV, the lyrical praise of Ludwig the Fenso, the playful murmur of Alfonso XIII. They are not gone, not entirely. They live in the stories, in the paintings, in the architecture, in the whispered repetitions of their names. And as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you will walk with them once more, through candlelit corridors, under painted ceilings, across moonlit gardens. You will not ask them for the truth, for truth in such stories is as elusive as the perfume of a vanished lover. You will only listen, and they will tell you in their own way that the crowns they wore were heavy, but it was the weight of their hearts that shaped them most of all. Somewhere a door closes softly. The story for now is at an end. But in the quiet after, their footsteps still echo, steady, graceful, unhurried, as they pass into the halls of memory where they will live forever. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.